Ireland. The name alone evokes images of mist-cloaked landscapes, ancient stones that pulse with the weight of history, and a land where every whisper of wind carries a forgotten legend. The lush hills, the rocky shores, and the deep, mysterious woods seem to hum with an energy older than time itself. In this place, the boundaries between the known world and the mystical realms blur, where myths and realities intertwine like the mist that weaves through the hills at dawn. We're about to step into that world, the world of Irish mythology. This is a land where gods, heroes, and creatures beyond imagination once walked the earth, where the battles between light and darkness shape the very fabric of existence. The stories you will hear are as old as the earth itself, passed down through generations, carried on the winds, written in the stones, and spoken in the songs of the people. They are stories of creation, of chaos, of love, betrayal, and the eternal struggle for power. In Ireland, myth is not just a collection of ancient tales, it is the very essence of the land. The mists that swirl through the valleys are said to be the breath of the gods, and the ancient rocks that dot the countryside are thought to be the resting places of warriors and kings who once ruled both the mortal and divine realms. But Ireland is more than just a land of magic. It is a place where the veil between the physical world and the other world is thin, where one can walk into the past or slip into a realm of gods and spirits with a single step. The Irish mythological tradition can be divided into 4 great cycles, each telling its own tale, yet all woven together by a common thread of magic, power, and destiny. These cycles form the foundation of Ireland's mythological identity: the mythical cycle, the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, and the historical cycle. Each of these cycles reveals different aspects of Ireland's past, blending gods, heroes, and mortals in a tapestry that is as rich and intricate as the land itself. The mythical cycle is where it all begins, where the land is shaped by the hands of gods and monsters, where the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, bring magic to the earth, and where the very foundations of the land's power are forged in the fire of conflict and creation. This is the story of the gods who once ruled over Ireland, and their descendants who walked among mortals, bearing with them both blessings and curses. The Ulster cycle follows the tragic and heroic tale of the warriors of Ulster, most famously Cuchulainn, a hero whose feats and fall would echo throughout the ages. Here we find blood, betrayal, and valour, as the warriors of Ulster face invasions, internal strife, and the brutal realities of war. In the Fenian cycle we meet Fionn mac Cumhaill and the Fianna, a group of legendary warriors whose bond to one another and their country would be tested by both enemies and their own hearts. Fionn's wisdom and leadership are challenged by betrayal, love, and the relentless pursuit of honour. The historical cycle, while grounded more in historical events than the others, still contains its share of legendary figures and feats. It tells of the great High Kings of Ireland, their struggles for dominance, and the eventual merging of the mythological and historical worlds, as Ireland was united under the banner of the Kings of Tara. As we step into this world, we're not simply observing myths from a distance. We're entering into the heart of Ireland, where gods, heroes, and monsters are not relics of the past, but living presences that still shape the land and the lives of those who call it home. The gods once ruled here, and their influence still lingers in the winds that sweep across the plains, the shadows that stretch across the mountains, and the ancient stones that stand as silent witnesses to the passing of time. In the beginning, there was only chaos, a vast, untamed world filled with primordial forces. Then, from the depths of this chaos, the first sparks of creation were born. It is said that the world was shaped by the will of the gods, each one of them a being of immense power, embodying the forces of nature and the elements. The Tuatha Dé Danann, a race of divine beings, were among the first to walk the earth. They came from the heavens, from the other world, and brought with them gifts of magic and knowledge that would forever change the fate of Ireland. Among the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann were the great Nuada, king of the gods, whose silver arm would one day become a symbol of both loss and restoration. Lugh, the brilliant hero and god of many skills, who would later become the saviour of the gods in their greatest battle, and the mighty Dagda, whose cauldron could heal and nourish, and whose magical harp could control the seasons. Together these gods were not just rulers, they were creators, warriors, and stewards of the land. But they were not alone in this world. They were not the first to inhabit Ireland, nor were they the only ones who sought to claim it as their own. Before them, other beings had arrived, each bringing their own power and ambitions. The Fomorians, a race of dark, twisted creatures, ruled the seas and the skies, and their influence stretched across the land like a shadow. These beings were as much a part of Ireland's world as the gods themselves, and the conflict between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians would shape the destiny of the land. And so, our journey begins with the gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, stepping down from the heavens to claim Ireland as their own. With them, they bring their magic, their treasures, and their rivals. Their arrival is both a blessing and a curse, for in their wake follows a storm of battle, betrayal, and prophecy. The fate of Ireland, as well as the fate of the gods themselves, will be forged in the fires of conflict. As we move through this story, we will witness the rise and fall of gods and kings, the birth of heroes, and the forging of magical artifacts that will shape the destiny of the land. We will hear the whispers of ancient battles fought on the plains of Mag Tuired, the legendary feasts held in the halls of the gods, and the tragic tales of those who sought power, glory, and revenge. This is a journey into the very soul of Ireland, where myths come alive, and the land itself seems to pulse with the memories of forgotten ages. And so, we set our feet upon the mist-covered path that leads us through Ireland's mythical past. The gods have come, and the land is waiting. Long before the first humans set foot upon the shores of Ireland, before the vast green hills and the rolling mist became home to the ancient tribes, the land itself was shaped by forces older than time. The earth was a living, breathing entity, filled with magic, mystery, and untold secrets. The sun and moon circled the skies in an eternal dance, while the seas whispered songs of forgotten ages. It was a time before history, a time when the gods walked freely among mortals, and the world was a canvas upon which the first stories of creation would be painted. The creation of Ireland, and of the world, is a tale that stretches back to the earliest moments of existence, when chaos and order vied for dominion over the land. In the beginning, there was nothing but a great expanse of water, endless, unbroken, and without form. From this primordial sea arose the first of the gods, beings of unimaginable power, who were born from the very elements of nature itself. These gods would lay the foundation for the world, shaping it from the chaos into something that could sustain life. The land, they say, was not always fertile or green. It was a barren place, with only the sea and sky stretching out endlessly. But the gods came, and with them they brought light, air, and fire. They shaped the earth, creating the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the meadows. The earth itself was alive with their magic, and the land began to pulse with the divine energy that would sustain all life to come. This was the birth of Ireland, a land not just of rock and soil, but of magic, of spirit, of an ancient power that would be felt for millennia. The first beings to step onto this newly formed land were the Tuatha Dé Danann, a race of gods and goddesses whose powers far surpassed those of mortals. They arrived in Ireland after travelling from the distant otherworld, a realm of enchantment and wonder that existed beyond the reach of ordinary men. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not simply gods. They were creators, each one of them a force of nature in their own right. Among the most important of these gods was Danu, the mother goddess, from whom the Tuatha Dé Danann took their name. She represented the earth itself, the nourishing, life-giving force that sustained the world. Her children, the Tuatha Dé Danann, inherited her power, and each one of them had dominion over a different aspect of the world: water, fire, wind, and earth. Yet, as the Tuatha Dé Danann began to shape the land, they were not the first to come to Ireland. Long before their arrival, the island had already been visited by other beings, whose presence shaped the land in ways that the Tuatha Dé Danann would later have to reckon with. The first of these were the Fomorians, a race of monstrous beings who lived in the farthest reaches of the seas. The Fomorians were twisted, dark and cruel, creatures of the deep who were said to have come from the shadows of the world. They were both a physical and spiritual threat to the gods, for they embodied chaos and destruction in their purest forms. The Fomorians ruled the seas, and their influence stretched over the land like a dark cloud, leaving devastation in their wake. The arrival of the Fomorians marked the beginning of a long-standing conflict that would shape the destiny of Ireland. But the Tuatha Dé Danann, undeterred by the dark creatures who came before them, knew that they had a destiny to fulfill, a destiny that would bring them face to face with the Fomorians and other forces that sought to challenge their rule. In the very earliest days of creation, however, the land was not just a battleground between gods and monsters. It was a land of creation and destruction, of life and death, where the first seeds of civilization were sown. The first people who would walk the land of Ireland were the children of Cessair, led by the great woman Cessair, who was the first mortal to set foot on the island. Cessair, along with her people, arrived in Ireland long before the Tuatha Dé Danann, during a time when the land was still wild and untamed. According to the legends, Cessair was the daughter of the great Fomorian leader, and she came to Ireland in search of refuge after a great flood that threatened to destroy her people. She and her followers made their way across the seas, driven by a sense of destiny and a need to survive. The story of Cessair and her people is intertwined with a great flood, a cataclysmic event that is said to have wiped out much of the early world. The flood, like many such events in mythology, is symbolic of both renewal and destruction, representing the cyclical nature of existence, the constant ebb and flow of life and death, creation and destruction. The flood was the first test of the land, and Cessair and her people became the first mortals to live on its shores. However, the children of Cessair were not to remain on the island for long. Their time in Ireland was brief, and after the floodwaters receded, they vanished into the annals of myth. But their arrival marked the beginning of something new, the first of many cycles of people who had come to call Ireland their home. In the wake of Cessair's people came Partholon, a great leader who led another tribe to Ireland and established the first known civilization on the island. Partholon's people brought agriculture, law, and order to the land, and they worked to tame the wildness that had once ruled the island. Under Partholon's rule, Ireland became a land of growth, but the shadow of the Fomorians loomed large, and their destructive power was never far behind. The next to arrive were the Nemedians, another tribe of gods who sought to claim Ireland as their own. They were a warrior people, and under the leadership of their great chief Nemed they waged war against the Fomorians, driving them back for a time, but the Fomorians would not be easily defeated, and the Nemedians were soon drawn into a bitter struggle for control of the island. The arrival of the Nemedians was the beginning of the constant cycle of conflict between the forces of order, represented by the gods and their mortal followers, and the forces of chaos, represented by the Fomorians and other dark beings. The Fomorians would continue to be a central part of Irish mythology, always seeking to corrupt and destroy the world that the gods had made. And with every new wave of settlers, Cessair, Partholon, Nemed, and others, the stage was set for the epic struggles that would unfold in the centuries to come. The first days of Ireland were filled with magic and conflict. The gods, the Fomorians, and the mortal tribes all sought their place in the world, and it was here, in the mists of time, that the great battles, alliances, and stories of Ireland's mythological history began to take root. The land itself, shaped by these divine and mortal forces, would forever bear the scars and the blessings of those who came before. In the end, however, the question remains, would the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, with their powers of creation and destruction, rise to rule this land forever? Or would they, like those before them, be cast down by the forces of chaos and darkness that never cease to threaten the fragile peace of Ireland? Only time and the gods themselves would reveal the answer. The mists had barely begun to lift from the shores of Ireland when the true gods arrived, beings whose very presence commanded the earth and sky, and whose powers defied the understanding of mortals. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not like any people who had come before. They were gods from the other world, immortal and divine, and their coming to Ireland would forever change the fate of the land. As they approached the island, their ship sailed silently across the horizon, shrouded in mist. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not arrive with thunderous noise or sweeping fanfare, as some might expect of gods. Their approach was silent, almost ghostly, as if they had appeared from a distant realm beyond mortal comprehension. The mist that followed them were thick with magic, and it is said that the very air shimmered with the force of their power. They stepped onto the shores of Ireland with purpose, for they knew that their destiny was to shape the land in ways that mortals could never imagine. At the head of these gods was Nuada, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was a mighty god, tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to burn with the fire of the heavens themselves. His presence alone inspired awe in all who beheld him, for he was the embodiment of divine justice and authority. Nuada wore a crown of shining silver, a symbol of his sovereignty over both the mortal and divine realms. He ruled with wisdom and strength, and under his leadership the Tuatha Dé Danann began to establish their dominion over Ireland. With him was Dagda, the great father god of abundance and fertility, whose immense power was matched only by his generosity. His belly was said to be as round as the earth itself, and his magical cauldron could provide endless food, healing, and sustenance. Dagda was the embodiment of life and nature's endless cycle. He had the power to summon storms and control the harvests, and his presence brought prosperity to the land. Lugh, the Shining One, was the god of the sun, the arts, and the many skills that a mortal could master. His strength, wisdom, and beauty were unparalleled. He was a master of the spear, and his presence on the battlefield was both a boon and a terror. Lugh was a god of many talents, smithing, music, healing, and prophecy, and his power was so vast that he could control the very forces of nature itself. He was destined to play a crucial role in the battles to come. And then there was Brigid, the goddess of fire, poetry, fertility, and wisdom. Her beauty was renowned, and her power was as bright as the flame she commanded. She was the protector of all things creative and artistic, and her voice could calm the fiercest of storms. Brigid was revered not only for her divine abilities, but also for her role in guiding humanity toward enlightenment, teaching them the arts of healing and knowledge. She was a goddess who bridged the gap between the divine and the human, inspiring mortals to reach for greatness. The Tuatha Dé Danann brought with them 4 sacred treasures, items of immense power that would shape the fate of the land. These treasures were not mere weapons or trinkets. They were imbued with the very essence of the gods themselves, each one a symbol of the divine power that the Tuatha Dé Danann wielded. These were the spear of Lugh, the sword of Nuada, the stone of destiny, and the cauldron of Dagda. The spear of Lugh's was said to never miss its mark, and it could pierce any armour or shield. It was a weapon of destruction, but also a symbol of victory. Lugh himself wielded this spear, and in his hands it was an instrument of justice that could not be overcome. The sword of Nuada was a symbol of kingship and power. It was a blade that could strike down any enemy with a single blow, and it was said to possess a will of its own. Whoever held this sword would command great authority, for the blade was bound to the spirit of the king it served. It was a weapon that demanded respect and obedience, for it had tasted the blood of kings and warriors alike. The Stone of Destiny was a great stone that stood at the heart of Ireland. It was said that whoever stood upon it and spoke their claim would have their destiny fulfilled. This stone was not just a physical object, it was a symbol of Ireland's sovereignty, and it held the power to bind the gods, kings, and mortals to their fates. Finally, the cauldron of Dagda was a vessel of endless nourishment. It could feed an entire army and was said to bring prosperity wherever it went. The cauldron was a symbol of Dagda's power over life and death, for it could heal wounds, restore life, and even summon the spirits of the dead. It was a tool of both creation and destruction, a reflection of the ever-changing cycle of life. These treasures were more than mere artifacts. They were the keys to Ireland's future, the weapons and symbols that would shape the battles to come. But even as the Tuatha Dé Danann settled into their new home, they were not without rivals. The Fomorians, the dark, monstrous beings who had come before, still lingered in the shadows. They were the antithesis of the Tuatha Dé Danann, embodiments of chaos, corruption and destruction. They were twisted, with some bearing multiple arms or eyes, and their very presence brought fear to the land. The Fomorians ruled over the seas and the dark corners of the world, and their influence spread like a blight across the land. The first great conflict between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians was inevitable. The gods had come to Ireland with a vision of order, of prosperity, of light, and the Fomorians represented everything that threatened that vision. As the two forces clashed, the heavens themselves seemed to tremble, and the very earth shook with the power of their battle. But the Tuatha Dé Danann, with their superior powers and treasures, were destined to emerge victorious. Their gods were not just conquerors, they were creators, nurturers and warriors, and their magic would shape Ireland into a land where both the divine and the mortal could thrive. The Battle of Mag Tuired would be the stage upon which the fate of Ireland would be decided. But that battle was yet to come. In the meantime, the Tuatha Dé Danann began to settle in their new home, establishing their courts and gathering their followers. Nuada, now king of the gods, ruled with wisdom, and Lugh's light guided their way. Brigid taught the people the arts of poetry and healing, while Dagda ensured that the land flourished with his cauldron's gifts. Ireland had entered a golden age, one where the gods walked the earth, and magic and beauty were woven into every moment. But in the distance the Fomorians stirred, waiting for the moment when they would once again rise to challenge the gods. The forces of light and darkness were on a collision course, and the fate of Ireland would soon be sealed in the fires of war. The first great battle between the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the monstrous Fomorians would not only decide the fate of Ireland, but it would forever shape the legacy of both sides. It was a conflict not born of personal vendettas, but of a cosmic clash, of light versus darkness, of creation versus destruction. The Battle of Mag Tuired took place in the heart of Ireland, on a plain where the earth had been scarred by the ages, where the stones and soil seemed to remember the weight of history. The Tuatha Dé Danann had already begun to establish their dominion over the land, but the Fomorians, still lurking in the depths, knew they could not allow this. Their dark reign had once held sway, and they would stop at nothing to reclaim what they saw as theirs. The battle began with the arrival of the Fomorian armies. These were not mere soldiers. They were nightmarish beings, creatures of twisted shape and horrifying power. Some had one eye, some had none at all, some had multiple arms, others had skin that looked like the bark of ancient trees. They were giants, demons, and spirits bound in physical form. Their presence was a corruption of the natural world, a physical manifestation of chaos itself. As they marched towards the battlefield, the skies grew darker, the winds howled with fury, and the very earth seemed to recoil in fear. Leading them was Baelor, the Fomorian king, a being so fearsome that even his gaze could bring death. It was said that his eye, a single, massive orb, held the power to destroy anything it looked upon. The legends tell that when he opened this eye, all who were within its sight would be struck dead. It was a weapon so terrible that no mortal could hope to defeat it. Baelor was a towering figure, with skin that glimmered like polished stone, and his army followed him in a relentless dark tide. On the opposite side stood the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, their ranks led by Nuada, the silver-armed king. The Tuatha Dé Danann were ready. They had prepared for this day, knowing that the Fomorians would come, and knowing that only a victory could secure their place in Ireland. With them they carried their 4 treasures, and they brought not only strength, but also wisdom, strategy, and magic. Lugh, with his spear of light, stood alongside Nuada, while Dagda carried his cauldron, his gifts of abundance, and his mighty club. Brigid rallied the warriors with her song, while Dagda's healing powers made sure the gods were strong and ready for the fight. The Tuatha Dé Danann were ready to face their darkest foes. The 2 armies clashed with the fury of the ancient world. The roar of battle echoed across the land, a cacophony of gods and monsters locked in combat. The Fomorians, with their sheer numbers and monstrous forms, pushed back the Tuatha Dé Danann at first, their dark power and magic seeming to overwhelm the gods' more disciplined forces. For a moment, it seemed as if the gods might be driven from the land they had just claimed. But Nuada, though mighty, was soon struck in the arm by a Fomorian spear. His arm was severed, a blow that would prove to be a critical turning point in the battle. According to the laws of the gods, a king with a blemish or wound could no longer rule, and Nuada, despite his power, fell from grace. His injury threatened to unravel the leadership of the Tuatha Dé Danann, casting a shadow of uncertainty over their cause. Yet, the gods were not without hope. The battle raged on, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, though shaken by Nuada's injury, were guided by the strategic brilliance of Lugh. His spear, the spear of Lugh, danced through the air, striking down Fomorian after Fomorian with deadly precision. The Tuatha Dé Danann began to rally, pushing the Fomorians back, gaining ground with every passing hour. Lugh's skill and leadership brought a glimmer of hope to the struggling gods. It was during this moment of chaos that the most fateful event of the battle occurred. Baelor, towering above the fray, stood watching from the edge of the battlefield. His single, terrible eye glimmered, ready to unleash its destructive power. The ground trembled as he prepared to cast his gaze upon the Tuatha Dé Danann, aiming to end their resistance in a single, devastating blow. The Fomorian king was ready to bring about their annihilation, and the gods' last hope seemed to be fading fast. But fate had other plans. In the midst of the chaos, a prophecy was fulfilled. It was said that Baelor would one day be slain by his own nephew, a god born of light, and that day had come. Lugh, the god of many skills, was the one to carry out this fate. With his spear raised high, Lugh surged forward, weaving through the melee. The air around him crackled with the power of his ancestors, and his hands, guided by destiny itself, hurled the spear of Lugh with such force that it pierced the air like a streak of lightning. The spear struck Bela squarely in the eye, the very eye that had brought death to so many. The force of the blow was so great that it shattered his skull, and Bela fell to the earth with a mighty crash, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. With the fall of Bela, the Fomorians were thrown into disarray. Their leader, their source of power, was gone, and their ranks faltered. Lugh had struck the blow that shifted the tide of the battle. The gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann seized upon the moment, rallying with renewed strength. The Fomorians, without their leader, and now beset on all sides by the might of the gods, began to retreat, their once imposing forces scattered and broken. The victory was hard won, but it was complete. The Tuatha Dé Danann had triumphed. The land, once threatened by the Fomorians, was now theirs to rule. The gods had proven their strength, and the legacy of their triumph would echo through the ages. In the aftermath of the battle, however, the cost of victory became clear. Nuada, despite his role as king, was unable to return to his throne, his injury too great to overlook. But Dian-Sesht, the healer of the gods, crafted for him a magnificent silver arm, a gift that restored him to his full glory. Though he could not rule as king without being whole, the restoration of Nuada's arm symbolized hope and renewal for the gods. He had lost much, but not all. He had lost an arm, but he had gained something else, a renewed sense of purpose. As for Lugh, the hero of the day, his role in the victory ensured that his name would be remembered for generations to come. His victory over Bela sealed his place among the greatest of the gods, and it was said that the spear of Lugh would become an iconic symbol of justice, skill, and destiny. The gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann now stood victorious, but they knew that their reign would not last forever. As they looked out over the battlefield, the winds carried with them the sense of something greater, a future where their dominion would be challenged again, where other forces would rise to take their place. The gods' golden age had begun, but as the sun set on Mag Tuired, they knew that their reign was merely the beginning of a much greater story. The fate of Ireland and of the gods themselves was far from decided. Victory was not without its cost, and though the Tuatha Dé Danann had triumphed over the Fomorians in the Battle of Mag Tuired, the gods now faced a new challenge. With Bela dead and the Fomorians retreating to the shadows, the gods looked to the future. Yet, even as their lands began to heal and peace settled over Ireland, they were burdened by an unresolved issue, the fate of their king Nuada. Nuada, once a mighty king, had been grievously wounded during the battle. His arm had been severed by a Fomorian strike, and according to the ancient laws of the gods, a king who was not whole was unfit to rule. His injury, though not fatal, marked a critical turning point in his reign. His inability to return to the throne cast a shadow over the Tuatha Dé Danann, for their king had been defeated not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the very laws that govern divine leadership. The Tuatha Dé Danann needed a ruler, a leader who could guide them through this period of uncertainty. It seemed as though the divine law was clear. Nuada's reign was over. Yet, despite his injury, Nuada was far from powerless. His spirit was unbroken, and his desire to lead his people remained strong. He would not be cast aside so easily. And so, it was that Dian-Sesht, the healer of the gods, worked tirelessly to restore Nuada to his rightful place. Dian-Sesht was a god of great skill, known for his ability to heal even the most grievous wounds. But this task would be no simple matter. The loss of a limb was not something that could be healed with magic alone. No ordinary healing would suffice for a king whose very identity was tied to his physical and spiritual wholeness. Dian Sesh's solution was a creation of wondrous craftsmanship, a silver arm, a perfect and intricate replacement for Nuada's lost limb. The arm was made from the finest silver, enchanted with magic that imbued it with both strength and beauty. It was said to be as functional as any human arm, yet far stronger, far more resilient. The silver arm was not just a replacement, but a symbol of renewal, of hope, and of Nuada's unyielding determination to rule his people. When Nuada received the silver arm, it was a moment of profound significance. The gods gathered around him as he donned his new arm, a dazzling and shining symbol of his restoration. It was not just a physical return to power, it was the reaffirmation of his rightful place as king. Nuada, now whole again, could take his throne once more. He had not been defeated, he had been tested, and he had returned stronger for it. But the world had changed, and so had the people. Even with his arm restored, Nuada faced new challenges. Bress, a half Fomorian, had briefly ruled over the Tuatha Dé Danann after Nuada's injury. His reign, however, had been marked by suffering and oppression. Bress had sought to weaken the gods, forcing them into submission and extracting tribute from them. His rule had been a time of hardship for the Tuatha Dé Danann, and his tyrannical ways had caused unrest. As the gods celebrated Nuada's return, Bress's reign came to an end. He was cast out, and the gods turned once more to Nuada to guide them. But while the gods were united in their victory, there was a new sense of foreboding in the air. The Tuatha Dé Danann had triumphed in battle, but they were beginning to understand that their reign would not last forever. The world was shifting, and the time of the gods was drawing to a close. Lugh, the great hero of the battle, stood alongside Nuada. He had become a hero in his own right, and his place among the gods was now solidified. Lugh, with his many talents, was now seen as one of the foremost among the Tuatha Dé Danann. His spear, the Spear of Lugh, had been the deciding factor in the defeat of Baelor and the Fomorians, and his wisdom had turned the tide in the gods' favour. Though Lugh was not yet king, he had become a symbol of hope and strength for the gods. He was their shining beacon, a warrior of unmatched skill and courage, whose bravery would continue to shape the fate of Ireland. But even his victories could not quell the growing realization that the gods' time on the earth was finite. With Nuada's return to power, the Tuatha Dé Danann began to rebuild. Their lands began to flourish once more, with their harvest bountiful, and their cities and courts filled with music and celebration. But beneath the surface, the gods knew that the Fomorians would one day return. Their battle was far from over, and as they celebrated their victory, they were also preparing for the next great conflict, one that would determine the fate of Ireland and their very existence. The second battle of Mag Tuired loomed on the horizon, and the gods knew that they would need all their strength, all their wisdom, and all their courage to face the next challenge. But for now, they rested. For now they took solace in the restoration of their king, and in the knowledge that they had once again secured their place in the world. They had returned from the brink of defeat, and in their hearts burned the belief that they could overcome any obstacle. But the Fomorians were not defeated. They had only retreated. The gods could not rest for long. The time for rebuilding was drawing to a close, and the Tuatha Dé Danann would soon face their greatest battle yet. The return of Nuada marked not only the restoration of the Tuatha Dé Danann's rule, but the inevitable march towards the second battle of Mag Tuired, a battle that would seal their fate. For though they had triumphed over the Fomorians once, the shadow of darkness still loomed, waiting to rise again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills of Ireland as the gods prepared for the second great clash with the Fomorians. The Tuatha Dé Danann, fresh from their victory in the first battle, had begun to rebuild their kingdom under the leadership of Nuada, now whole once again with his silver arm. The land prospered under their reign, and peace reigned for a time, but the gods knew that it was only temporary. The Fomorians, despite their defeat, had not been vanquished. Their dark king, Bela, had fallen, but his loss did not mean the end of the Fomorian threat. The Fomorians were not just a tribe or an army, they were an embodiment of chaos itself, and they would not rest until the Tuatha Dé Danann were driven from Ireland forever. Bress, the half-Fomorian ruler who had briefly taken the throne of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was gone, but the Fomorians' power remained. With the death of their leader, Bela, the Fomorians sought revenge, and the time for another great battle had come. This time the Tuatha Dé Danann would be ready. The second battle of Mag Tuired was upon them, and all of Ireland seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. It would be a battle unlike any the land had seen before, an epic clash of gods, warriors and monsters. The stakes were higher than ever, for this time the gods were not just defending their right to rule Ireland, they were fighting for survival itself. The battle was not just one of brute strength, but one of destiny. The Tuatha Dé Danann were led by Nuada, with his silver arm gleaming in the light, and the spear of Lugh crackling with power in the hands of the great hero Lugh. The Tuatha Dé Danann had their 4 treasures, the spear, the sword, the stone, and the cauldron, each representing their divine authority and their right to rule the land. But the Fomorians had their own weapon, one that would shake the heavens themselves. Bela, despite his death in the first battle, had left behind a legacy. His daughter, Aithne, had borne a son, and this son, Lugh's nephew, was destined to play a crucial role in the coming conflict. Bela's death had been foretold by prophecy. He would fall by the hand of his own blood, and it would be his own nephew who would strike the fatal blow. It was this prophecy that would guide the gods and the Fomorians to the battlefield at Mag Tuired. Lugh, now fully grown and brimming with the wisdom and strength of his many talents, had already proved himself as the hero of the first battle of Mag Tuired, where he had struck down Bela with the spear of Lugh. His triumph over the Fomorian king had sealed his place among the greatest of the gods. But now, with the Fomorians regrouped and more powerful than ever, it was up to him once again to lead the charge. As the 2 armies prepared for battle, the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The Fomorians had amassed their forces, giants, monsters, and creatures of darkness from the depths of the sea and the farthest corners of the earth. Their army was vast, their hunger for vengeance fierce. The earth shook with the fury of their march, and the air grew thick with the scent of salt water and storm. And then, on the horizon, they appeared. Bela's monstrous army, led by his grandson Bress, who had returned to command the Fomorian forces after his exile from the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Fomorians were vast and numerous, an ocean of twisted figures and hideous forms, their eyes burning with rage. The gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann stood ready, their spirits unbroken despite the weight of the coming battle. Nuada, though no longer the king he once was, stood at the forefront with his silver arm raised high, rallying the troops. Lugh, with his divine spear, stood beside him, ready to fulfill his destiny and strike the Fomorians down once more. The battle began with a great cry, a roar of fury that echoed across the plains of Mag Tuired. The Tuatha Dé Danann clashed with the Fomorian hordes in a frenzy of steel and magic. Lugh's spear of Lugh whistled through the air, each strike sending waves of energy that cut through the Fomorian ranks like a blade through water. But the Fomorians were relentless, their twisted forms lurching forward in an endless tide. Among the Fomorian ranks was Bela's daughter Aithne, who had not forgotten the prophecy of her father's death. Aithne had long known that Lugh was destined to bring an end to her father's reign of terror, but she could not accept it. She stood alongside Bress, hoping to bring down the Tuatha Dé Danann and avenge the death of Bela. Her eyes burned with hatred for Lugh, the son of Cian, whom she saw as the cause of her father's fall. And so, the two armies met with a fury that shook the heavens themselves. The Fomorians wielded their monstrous weapons, while the Tuatha Dé Danann relied on their skill, magic, and divine gifts. Nuada's silver arm swung with divine precision, cutting down the enemy with a force that was both majestic and terrifying. Brigid's magic was unleashed, summoning fires of purity to burn the Fomorians back. Dagda's mighty club swung through the air, and Lugh's spear cut through the Fomorians' ranks like a storm. But despite the might of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Fomorians were an unstoppable force. Their numbers were too great and their darkness was too deep. The Tuatha Dé Danann began to falter, their energy and strength beginning to wane under the crushing weight of the Fomorian onslaught. The gods fought valiantly, but it seemed as if the darkness would overwhelm them. It was then, in the heart of the battle, that Lugh saw Bela's grandson, Bress, attempting to strike down Nuada. Bress, filled with bitterness and vengeance, sought to finish the work his grandfather had started. But Lugh saw him, and he moved with the swiftness of a storm, his spear aimed straight for Bress's heart. The spear of Lugh flew through the air with a rare sound like thunder, and in a flash it struck Bress, piercing his chest and ending his reign. His body crumpled to the ground and his army faltered. But the true turning point of the battle came when Lugh turned his gaze to the monstrous Bela, whose son had risen to challenge him. The death of Bress caused the Fomorian ranks to tremble, but Bela's massive eye glared out over the battlefield, unleashing a curse of death and destruction that swept across the battlefield like a black fog. In that moment Lugh, knowing the prophecy that his own blood would destroy the Fomorian king, stepped forward one final time. His hand gripped the spear, and with a mighty shout he hurled it toward Bela's eye. The spear struck true, piercing the massive orb and unleashing a wave of magic that shattered Bela's dark reign forever. With his death, the Fomorian forces broke, and the tide of battle turned once more. The second battle of Mag Tuired was won, but at great cost. The gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann had emerged victorious, but the land was scarred, and their enemies had not been fully eradicated. Though Bela was gone, the shadow of the Fomorians would always linger over Ireland. The gods had triumphed again, but the struggle for Ireland was far from over. As the dust of the battlefield settled, the gods knew that they had secured their place for now. But their reign was slipping, and they understood that they could not forever hold back the forces of darkness. The Tuatha Dé Danann had survived, but their time on the earth was drawing to a close. The winds that blew across the plains carried with them a whisper. The gods' rule was only temporary. The future would belong to mortals, and the gods would soon fade into legend. In the shadow of the great battles and the shifting tides of fate, the island of Ireland began to feel the stirring of new heroes, the next generation of warriors and kings who would rise to carry the weight of Ireland's destiny. The Tuatha Dé Danann, though victorious in their battles, knew their time in the mortal realm was drawing to a close. The myths of old would soon be replaced by those of new heroes, mortals who would shape the land with their courage, their strength, and their hearts. One of these heroes was destined to become the greatest of them all. His name was Cuchulainn, and his legend would echo through the ages, a story of sacrifice, honour, and tragic fate. The land of Ulster, one of Ireland's 4 provinces, was where this legend would begin. Ulster, known for its fierce warriors and noble kings, was ruled by Concobar mac Nessa, a king of great wisdom and strength. Under his rule, Ulster had become a kingdom of pride and honour, home to some of the greatest warriors in Ireland. But within this kingdom there was a prophecy, one that spoke of a hero who would rise, a warrior who would save Ulster in its darkest hour. This hero, it was foretold, would be born of impossible circumstances, a child of fate, with strength beyond that of any mortal man. Cuchulainn was born as Setanta, a boy who would be raised by Curoe, the king of the Ulster Cycle's great warriors, the Red Branch Knights. But even in his infancy, it was clear that Setanta was no ordinary child. He was the son of Lugh, the great god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and Dectyre, a mortal princess. Though his father was a god, Setanta's mortal blood ran strong, and his destiny was not to remain in the realm of the gods. He was to become a hero of the mortal world. As a child, Setanta showed signs of his extraordinary strength and talent. He was quick to learn, skilled in the arts of war, and possessed a fiery temper that often led him into trouble. His prowess in combat, even as a young boy, was unmatched, and the people of Ulster began to whisper that the boy was destined for greatness. One of the first signs of his greatness came when Setanta was invited to a great feast hosted by Curoe and the Red Branch Knights. This was a time when feasts and celebrations were the heart of Ulster's culture, and warriors would gather to share tales of battle and honour. It was during this feast that Setanta's name would be forged into legend. At the feast, Setanta, eager to prove himself, was set to compete against the other warriors in a game of hurling, a traditional sport that required both strength and skill. The game was fierce, with the greatest of Ulster's warriors all taking part. Setanta, though still a boy, played with the strength and determination of a seasoned warrior, outmatching everyone in the field. However, as the game continued, a terrible tragedy occurred. Curoe, in a moment of heated competition, struck Setanta with a blow that sent the boy sprawling to the ground. But rather than submit to the pain, Setanta rose from the dirt, his anger burning like fire. In that moment, the true nature of his strength was revealed. He grabbed a weapon, an enchanted spear, and with a roar he cast it through the air, striking a massive hound guarding the gates of the castle. The hound fell, and in that instant the name Cuchulainn, meaning the Hound of Ulster, was born. It was a name that would come to embody the very essence of what it meant to be a hero, a warrior with the strength of a god and the heart of a mortal. From that day on, Setanta was known as Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster. His name spread across the land like wildfire, and the warriors of Ulster began to whisper of his impossible feats. Even Concobar mac Nessa, the great king of Ulster, saw that the boy was destined to become a hero unlike any the world had ever seen. But Cuchulainn's path to greatness would not be without trials. His story, like the land itself, would be one of bloodshed, sacrifice, and the heavy weight of prophecy. For though Cuchulainn was destined to become a hero, the price of his heroism would be steep. The kingdom of Ulster, under the rule of Concobar, had long been at odds with the neighbouring province of Connaught, ruled by the ambitious and cunning Queen Medb. It was Medb who would become the first true test of Cuchulainn's strength and character. Medb, seeking to expand her kingdom's power, coveted the brown bull of Cooley, a legendary beast whose strength was said to rival the gods. The bull was a symbol of Ulster's pride and wealth, and Medb's desire to steal it would bring war to the land. In the conflict that followed, Cuchulainn would find himself standing alone against an entire army. Ulster, having been cursed by a mysterious ailment, was unable to defend itself. It was a time of weakness, and the warriors of Ulster were rendered helpless, incapacitated by the curse. But Cuchulainn, though still a boy, refused to let his people fall. With no one else to stand beside him, Cuchulainn took it upon himself to protect Ulster's borders. Armed with his magical weapons, his spear, his shield, and his indomitable will, he single-handedly fought off the forces of Connaught. killing dozens of their warriors and holding the brown bull of Cooley's captors at bay. In the end, it was Cuchulain's bravery and skill that ensured Ulster's survival. Yet, as with all heroes, the price of victory was steep. The cattle raid of Cooley became not just a battle for cattle, but a defining moment in Cuchulain's story. His actions in the raid solidified his place as a hero of myth, but also set him on a path of endless conflict and loss. For even as Cuchulainn defended Ulster, the gods, the fates, and his own destiny would pull him toward a tragic end. Cuchulain's legacy would live on, but as with all great heroes, it would not be without pain. His story was one of brilliance and destruction, of light and shadow, one that would shape not only the land of Ulster, but the soul of Ireland itself. As Cuchulainn stood victorious after the cattle raid of Cooley, the echoes of the past seemed to call to him. His destiny was sealed, and his path would lead him through bloodshed and honour toward the tragic fate that awaited him. The winds of change were blowing across Ireland, and in the rise of Cuchulainn, the world was about to be irrevocably changed. The air was thick with tension, the horizon darkened with the approach of armies. The cattle raid of Cooley was a momentous event, one that would forever shape the legacy of Cuchulainn and the kingdom of Ulster. It began with a simple desire. Queen Medb of Connaught, greedy and powerful, coveted the brown bull of Cooley, a prize of immense value and a symbol of Ulster's wealth and strength. The bull was a creature of mythical importance, its power tied to the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. To steal it would be to steal Ulster's lifeblood. Medb, in her quest for domination, sought to steal the bull, but Ulster stood in her way. The Ulster cycle tells of how the warriors of Ulster, once among the finest in all of Ireland, were struck by a curse that rendered them defenceless. This was no ordinary ailment. The curse, cast upon them by Macha, the goddess of battle, rendered the warriors of Ulster incapacitated for a period of time, and it was in this time of weakness that Medb made her move. The warriors of Ulster were helpless, and with the king Concobar mac Nessa unable to defend his lands, the stage was set for an unprecedented invasion. But in the midst of this crisis, one figure stood apart from the rest, a single warrior who would stand between Medb's army and the sovereignty of Ulster. That warrior was Cuchulainn. At the time, Cuchulainn was still a young man, his reputation growing, but not yet fully realised. Despite his youth, his feats in battle had already earned him a place among the greatest warriors in Ireland. His immense strength, the magical powers of his weapons, and his extraordinary skill in combat were already the stuff of legend. Now, with the warriors of Ulster incapacitated and unable to fight, the weight of the kingdom's fate fell squarely upon his shoulders. Cuchulainn was left alone to defend Ulster. The odds were staggering. Medb's army, vast and determined, marched on Ulster, a force of thousands, while Cuchulainn stood at the gates of Ulster, the lone protector. But Cuchulainn was not one to be cowed by such numbers. His spirit was unbreakable, and his desire to defend his homeland burned like fire. The first encounter between Cuchulainn and Medb's forces was nothing short of legendary. With his magical spear, Gaebulg, a weapon of immense power, and his indomitable skill, Cuchulainn tore through the ranks of Connaught's warriors. It is said that he killed over 100 men in the first days of the conflict alone, each blow a testament to his unmatched skill in battle. But Cuchulainn's greatest act of heroism came when he single-handedly held the army of Connaught at bay at the ford of the Cattle. Medb, aware that she could not break through his defence, attempted to outwit him. She sent emissaries to him, attempting to make peace or offer him gifts, but Cuchulainn was resolute. He would not yield to threats, promises, or bargains. His only, desire was to protect Ulster from the wrath of Medb. The battle was brutal. Cuchulainn fought tirelessly, day after day, against the forces of Medb. It was said that at times his enemies did not know if they were fighting a man or a god, so fierce was his rage, so deadly his strikes. He was like a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless, and unyielding. The warriors of Connaught fell one by one, unable to withstand the fury of the Hound of Ulster. However, despite his incredible feats, the toll of the battle began to weigh on him. The cattle raid of Cooley was not just a physical conflict, it was a test of will. Cuchulainn stood alone, his strength tested by the constant onslaught of Medb's forces. His body, bruised and bloodied, bore the marks of the battles, but his resolve never faltered. As the days wore on, Medb, unable to break through his defences, sought another way to undermine Cuchulainn's position. She sent emissaries to challenge him, one by one, hoping to break his spirit. Fergus MacRoich, a former ally of Cuchulainn, who had once been part of the Ulster warriors, was sent to challenge him, hoping to sway him with his words. But Fergus, like all who came before him, found himself overpowered. Even his attempts at diplomacy fell on deaf ears. Cuchulainn, it seemed, was not a warrior who could be reasoned with. His heart was bound to the defence of his people, and nothing would change that. Finally, after several long days of battle, Medb's forces managed to outwit Cuchulainn by sending Lochlin, a warrior skilled in the arts of magic and deceit, to challenge him. Lochlin tricked Cuchulainn by using illusionary magic to deceive him into thinking his strength had failed. In a moment of false confidence, Cuchulainn was forced to retreat. But despite this setback, Medb's army was still no match for the courage and determination of Cuchulainn. Even though the forces of Connaught advanced toward the Brown Bull, the warrior's heart remained unyielding. At the end of the cattle raid of Cooley, when Medb's forces reached the Brown Bull, they found themselves facing their final challenge. Cuchulainn had delayed them long enough. The war had left scars on both sides, but for Ulster, Cuchulainn's courage had kept them from defeat. Ultimately, Medb's plans were thwarted, the bull was saved, and the fate of Ulster remained secure, if only for a time. But the victory came at a great personal cost. Cuchulainn's feats on the battlefield had earned him the undying respect of his people, but his strength came at the expense of his soul. The burden of such a tremendous defence would never leave him unscathed. In the aftermath, Cuchulainn's name became a legend, and his reputation grew to immense heights. Yet the price of victory was clear. His body, though seemingly indestructible in battle, began to break down, his mind haunted by the toll of his endless conflict. For even the greatest of heroes cannot fight forever without consequences. The dust had barely settled after the cattle raid of Cooley, and Ulster had narrowly avoided the calamity of losing its most prized possession, the Brown Bull of Cooley. But for Cuchulainn, the victory came at a personal cost that no one could fully comprehend. His legend had grown beyond mortal measure, but the toll of his heroic feats was beginning to take root in his body and soul. He had stood alone against the overwhelming forces of Medb and Connaught, and yet the battles he fought were not the true battle that awaited him. What Cuchulainn did not know, what no one could know, was that his final battle was one of fate and prophecy, and it would be a fight he could not win. The land of Ulster had been saved and the Brown Bull was returned, but the hero of this great victory, the Hound of Ulster, had begun to show the signs of his own undoing. His body, though still strong, had become weary. The Gaebulg, the magical spear that had been the instrument of his greatest victories, had taken a toll on him with every battle. His spirit, though unyielding, was fraying at the edges, worn down by the weight of so many conflicts. The prophecy that had once loomed over Cuchulainn, that he would die in his prime at the hands of his enemies, began to take on new meaning. Though Cuchulainn had always fought to preserve Ulster, to protect the people he loved, the universe had its own design, and it seemed that even a hero of his calibre could not escape the threads of fate that wove through the tapestry of time. The inevitable day came when Cuchulainn, brave, unyielding and heroic, faced the end of his journey. It began with a betrayal, one that would shatter the bonds between him and his people. Fionn mac Cumhail, the great leader of the Fianna, had long been a rival of Cuchulainn, though their rivalry had never led to open conflict. Yet, as the years passed, Cuchulainn's loyalty was tested by one of his closest allies, Fergus mac Roish, the former king of Ulster and one of the greatest warriors in the land. The rivalry between Fergus and Cuchulainn was not one of ill will, but of fate, each of them driven by a sense of duty and honour that sometimes clashed. But it was not Fergus or Fionn who would deliver the blow that ended Cuchulainn's life. It was a force greater than both, a betrayal by the very warriors he had once fought beside. The men of Ulster, filled with resentment and fear, turned on their greatest protector, driven by their own insecurities and the weight of their years of struggle. As the people grew weary of the hero's endless sacrifice, Cuchulainn's destiny became sealed. As the final days of his life approached, Cuchulainn withdrew to a lonely hilltop, where he stood alone against the forces that had come for him. His heart heavy with regret, his body scarred and exhausted from years of war, he prepared himself for the inevitable. It is said that he tied himself to a standing stone, refusing to let death take him without facing it on his own terms, even as his enemies closed in. There, standing in defiance of fate, he waited. The enemy forces, knowing that they could not defeat him in an open fight, resorted to trickery. They sent Lugh, the son of Curoy, to challenge Cuchulainn, hoping to bring an end to the legend with the final blow. Lugh, loyal yet bound by fate, found Cuchulainn, who was already at death's door. The two men, once allies and comrades, now faced each other across a battlefield of broken promises and shifting alliances. Despite the pain in his body and the weight of his heart, Cuchulainn stood tall. His spirit remained unbroken, even as the end drew near. He spoke his final words, not as a king or a warrior, but as a man who had lived his life to its fullest, without regret. And then, with a final, fatal blow, Lugh struck his heart, fulfilling the prophecy that Cuchulainn's end would come swiftly, but with honour. The death of Cuchulainn shook the very foundations of Ireland. It was a loss felt across the land, as the hero whose name had been whispered on every battlefield and in every corner of the world was now gone. The man who had once stood alone against the armies of Connaught, the one who had faced fate and conquered it time and again, had finally succumbed to his own. Yet even in death, Cuchulainn's legend did not fade. His body was placed in a heroic death pose, tied to the standing stone as a defiant reminder that even the greatest of heroes could fall. His warriors, seeing that their leader had fallen but not in defeat, rallied once more in his memory, fighting fiercely in the aftermath of his death. Cuchulainn's name would forever be etched into the history of Ulster and Ireland, and his legacy would inspire future generations to carry on the fight for what was right. But for all the glory of his life, his death was the greatest tragedy of all. Cuchulainn had not lived to see the fruits of his sacrifice, the peace that would come after the conflict. He had given everything for his people, yet his own people had never fully understood the depth of that sacrifice until it was too late. In the end, Cuchulainn's story was not just that of a hero. It was a story of the price of greatness, of the cost of standing alone, and of the tragedy that comes with being bound to fate. Cuchulainn had been a protector, a warrior, a king in his own right. But he had also been a man, and as with all men, he had to face the end of his journey. and so the hero's flame flickered and died, but in the hearts of the people he protected the light of Cú Chulainn would never fade. As the mythic age of the gods gave way to the age of heroes, Ireland's heart began to beat to a new rhythm. The Tuatha Dé Danann, though powerful, had faded into legend, leaving behind a rich tapestry of stories that would shape the future of the land. Mortals now took centre stage, and among them, one figure would rise to challenge the very definition of heroism. Fionn mac Cumhaill was born into a world of war and strife, but his destiny was unlike any other. The son of Cumhaill, a great warrior, and Muireann, a woman of unmatched beauty and wisdom, Fionn's early life was marked by tragedy and exile. His father, a leader of the Fianna, the elite warriors of Ireland, was slain in battle by the forces of Gol mac Morna, his rival. Fionn was but a child at the time, and his mother, fearing for his life, sent him away to be raised in secret by a wise old druid named Finnegas. But Fionn's fate was never far from the blood-stained soil of Ireland's battlegrounds. While under the tutelage of Finnegas, Fionn learned the arts of combat, magic, and the ways of the gods. It was during his time with the druid that Fionn encountered the Salmon of Knowledge, a mystical creature whose flesh granted wisdom and foresight to anyone who consumed it. The salmon lived in the sacred well of wisdom, and after much time spent searching for it, Finnegas finally caught the legendary fish. However, it was Fionn, by a twist of fate, who accidentally consumed the fish while cooking it. The moment Fionn tasted the salmon, knowledge flooded his mind. He was granted the wisdom of the world's greatest heroes, the strategies of past kings, and the secrets of the gods. Finnegas, realizing that Fionn had been chosen by fate, passed on the mantle of leadership to him, and it was from that moment on that Fionn's destiny became entwined with the rise of the Fianna. The Fianna were a group of legendary warriors, each sworn to serve Ireland with their lives. The warriors of the Fianna were not just fighters, they were guardians of the land, protectors of the weak, and seekers of justice. Under Fionn mac Cumhaill's leadership, the Fianna became the most formidable force in Ireland, their exploits and adventures echoing across the land. They were not merely soldiers, they were a brotherhood, bound by loyalty, courage, and a shared vision of what Ireland should be. Fionn's leadership was marked by both wisdom and bravery, but it was his unwavering sense of justice that set him apart. He was a king in all but name, his strength and intelligence guiding him through the most perilous of times. Yet, Fionn was not without his flaws. His story is not one of perfect heroism, but one that is as complex and human as the land he protected. His strength was his greatest asset, but it was also his greatest curse. In the many adventures of Fionn and the Fianna, there were battles against giants, magical creatures, and enemies from both within and beyond Ireland. One of the most famous of these adventures was the chase of the great boar of Benbulben, a creature of immense power that had terrorized the land. Fionn and his warriors pursued the boar through mountains and forests, finally cornering it in a remote valley. With great effort, Fionn was able to strike down the boar, a feat that earned him the admiration of all who witnessed it. Yet, not all of Fionn's exploits were of battle and glory. His love story with Grainne, the beautiful daughter of King Cormac mac Airt, would become one of the most tragic and pivotal chapters in his life. Grainne, promised in marriage to Fionn, fell in love with Diarmuid, one of Fionn's most loyal warriors. The affair between Grainne and Diarmuid set off a chain of events that led to betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately tragedy. Fionn's relationship with Grainne is marked by betrayal and deep loss. After learning of their affair, Fionn was consumed with rage and jealousy, and he set out on a relentless pursuit of Diarmuid. The Fianna, once united under Fionn's banner, were now divided by love, loyalty, and anger. Diarmuid, a man of honour, fled with Grainne, and though Fionn chased them across the land, their love proved stronger than his anger. Eventually, Diarmuid and Green were tragically killed by a wild boar, and Fionn, devastated by his own role in their deaths, was left with a broken heart and a fractured legacy. Though Fionn would continue to lead the Fianna, the rift caused by the death of Diarmuid would never truly heal. The warriors who had once fought together in harmony were now divided, torn apart by personal vendettas and old wounds. As the Fianna weakened, their power began to fade, and the golden age of Irish heroes was slowly coming to an end. But Fionn's story was not one of failure, it was one of sacrifice. Even as the Fianna crumbled, Fionn continued to fight for Ireland, leading his warriors through battle after battle, never once turning his back on the land he had sworn to protect. His greatest battles, however, were no longer fought on the field of war but within himself, as he struggled with the demons of betrayal and loss that haunted his soul. Fionn MacCumhail's legacy would live on through the legends of the Fianna, though the golden age of heroism that he represented would eventually pass into history. His name, forever tied to the salmon of knowledge and the Fianna, would be remembered not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of the complexity of human existence, a man torn between duty, love, and destiny. But even in his death, Fionn's story did not end. The legends of the Fianna would endure, passed down through generations, and his name would live on, a reminder of the brave warriors who once protected the land of Ireland with their strength, their courage, and their unwavering loyalty. As the story of Fionn MacCumhail fades into myth, the world of Irish heroes transitions into an era where the cycles of myth would slowly give way to the realities of kingship and law. But the spirit of the Fianna, that unyielding brotherhood of warriors, would forever remain in the heart of Ireland. As the Fianna continued their adventures, led by Fionn MacCumhail, their fame grew. They became more than just a group of warriors. They became the embodiment of Irish valour and heroism. Their feats were legendary, their skills unmatched, and their bond as a brotherhood unbreakable, at least for a time. But even the mightiest heroes must eventually face the weight of time and the cracks that appear in their unity. One of the greatest tales of the Fianna was their quest to defend Ireland from mystical creatures and ancient forces. While many saw the Fianna as mere warriors, their true power came from the magical treasures they wielded and their connection to the ancient powers that still lingered in the land. The Fianna were not just soldiers. They were guardians of Ireland's deep forgotten magic, and many of their adventures were intertwined with the supernatural forces that shaped the very fabric of the island. One such adventure began when the Fianna were summoned to the mountains of the north by the Púca, a trickster spirit who could shapeshift into any form. The Púca had been causing chaos throughout Ireland, leading travellers astray and sowing fear in villages with his deceptive illusions. When Fionn and his warriors arrived at the mountain, they found the Púca waiting for them, a terrifying figure that shifted between a giant wolf, a bird of prey, and a monstrous serpent. The Fianna had to use not only their strength but their wits to defeat the spirit, as brute force alone would not win the day. The battle with the Púca tested Fionn's wisdom as much as his strength. It was said that Fionn, with the wisdom he gained from the Salmon of Knowledge, was able to outsmart the trickster by calling upon the ancient magic of the land, forcing the Púca to reveal his true form. The Fianna captured the spirit, binding him to a sacred tree, where he could no longer harm the people of Ireland. This victory proved once again that the Fianna under Fionn's leadership were not just warriors, they were protectors of the land itself. Yet, despite the constant battles and victories, cracks began to form within the Fianna. Tension simmered, not only due to the external threats they faced, but also because of the internal conflicts that arose. One of the most significant sources of division came from Oisin, Fion's son, who was growing increasingly disillusioned with his father's leadership. Oisin, a great warrior in his own right, had inherited his father's strength and wisdom, but he also had a heart that longed for something more than the endless war that the Fianna fought. He began to question the morality of their actions, particularly their relentless pursuit of battle and glory. Oisin, known for his deep connection with nature and his love for the mystical creatures of Ireland, felt that the Fianna were losing sight of their true purpose. He longed for a time when the Fianna would seek peace rather than war, but Fionn, steadfast in his vision of the warrior's code, could not understand his son's desires. This division between father and son came to a head during a great battle against the forces of Crom Cruach, a dark god of the ancient past who sought to enslave Ireland once more. The Fianna marched to meet Crom's army at the plains of Fiachna, but there was an unease among the warriors. Oisin led a group of warriors who believed that they could negotiate with Crom Cruach, or at least delay the battle long enough to find a peaceful solution. Fionn, on the other hand, refused to negotiate. To him, there was only one way to deal with such evil: through battle and bloodshed. In the heat of the conflict, Oisin disobeyed his father's orders. He struck a deal with the dark forces, offering them a piece of Ireland in exchange for peace. This act of defiance shattered the unity of the Fianna. Fionn, seeing his son's disobedience as a betrayal of the warrior's code, was heartbroken. The father and son stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, each with their own vision of Ireland's future. It was a heartbreaking moment for both, for they each saw their actions as the right course, yet neither could reconcile with the other. Though the Fianna were victorious in the battle against Crom Cruach, the rift between Fionn and Oisin grew wider. Their bond as father and son was irreparably damaged, and the Fianna began to splinter. Some warriors, loyal to Fionn, sided with the old ways of battle and honour. Others, including Oisin, began to question if the endless wars were truly the right path for Ireland's future. The end of the Fianna seemed inevitable. They had been a great brotherhood, united by a common cause, but now their time was drawing to a close. The once invincible warriors of Fionn and Oisin had become divided, torn apart by their differing visions for Ireland. The Fianna's reign as the defenders of Ireland came to an end, not in a final great battle, but through internal division, the slow unravelling of their once unshakable unity. Fionn, in his later years, could only watch as the warriors he had once led so fearlessly began to drift away. Oisin left the Fianna, seeking a life away from war, drawn to the mystical lands of the Fairy Queen, where he would eventually fall under a powerful spell, one that would bind him to the other world and remove him from the mortal realm forever. The Fianna, without their great leaders, faded into legend. Fionn McCumhale's life was one of both triumph and tragedy. He had led the Fianna to greatness, but he also witnessed their collapse. As the years passed, Fionn grew older, and his once immense power began to wane. The Fianna, in the end, were no longer a force to be reckoned with, their legacy living on only in the songs and stories told by the bards. But Fionn's story did not end in obscurity. His name would be remembered forever as a symbol of the warrior spirit, the heart of Ireland's heroic age. Though the Fianna had fallen, their tales would live on in the hearts of the people, and their legacy would be passed down for generations to come. Fionn's story, filled with the glory of battle, the tragedy of betrayal, and the pain of a broken father-son bond, became the foundation for the Fenian cycle, a series of tales that would inspire future heroes and warriors in the centuries to come. The light of the Fianna had dimmed, and though the lands of Ireland were still filled with stories of their great deeds, the reality was that their time had passed. Fionn McCumhale, once the unquestioned leader of Ireland's most legendary band of warriors, had witnessed his greatest creation crumble before his very eyes. The fierce brotherhood of the Fianna, which had once stood united against the forces of darkness, had splintered under the weight of betrayal, personal ambition, and conflicting ideals. The fiery spark that had driven the warriors of Ireland was slowly fading. But despite the waning strength of the Fianna, Fionn's legacy continued to burn brightly. He had forged a kingdom of warriors, and his teachings would echo through the ages. Yet as Fionn grew older, his strength began to wane, and the burdens of leadership weighed heavily on him. The fire that had once burned so brightly within him had become a flicker of the past. In the years following the collapse of the Fianna, Fionn found himself facing betrayal, not just from external enemies, but from within his own ranks. Oisin, his son, once his most trusted ally, had left to seek peace and solace in the mystical realm of the Fairy Queen, leaving Fionn to bear the full weight of the Fianna's decline alone. Diarmuid, once one of the Fianna's greatest warriors, had fallen victim to Grain's love and the rift that had split the warriors. And as Fionn aged, those who remained loyal to him were fewer and fewer. But the ultimate betrayal came not from his son, nor from his warriors, but from the very core of his life, the Fianna itself. The warriors, once bound together by brotherhood and honour, began to fall apart, each seeking their own path. Fergus mac Roish, a former leader of the Fianna and one of its most steadfast members, began to question Fionn's leadership. The division between the old and the new, the battle-hardened warriors and those who had seen too much bloodshed, became increasingly evident. Fergus and others began to rebel against Fionn's iron grip, seeking a new leader who would bring them to glory again. Fionn, though proud and determined, began to see the cracks in his kingdom. Fergus, once a beloved ally, left Fionn's side and joined forces with enemies of the Fianna, including the ambitious and ruthless Ailill mac Mata, king of Connaught. It was a bitter betrayal, one that crushed Fionn's spirit, but it was not the last. The Fianna's final betrayal occurred during the Battle of Cuil Drebne. Fionn, desperate to keep his warriors united and protect Ireland from the forces gathering against them, made one last attempt to rally the Fianna against their enemies. Fergus, however, led his warriors in rebellion, turning against Fionn in the heat of battle and aligning himself with Ailill mac Mata. The result was catastrophic for the Fianna. The once mighty warriors were now divided, and the battlefield was filled with brothers fighting. Brothers. In the end, the battle was lost, not due to any lack of skill or bravery, but because the Fianna no longer stood as one. Their unity, the very core of their strength, had been shattered by betrayal and disillusionment. Fionn, heartbroken by the betrayal of his once loyal warriors, withdrew from the battlefield, his dreams of a unified Ireland now in ruins. As Fionn returned to his home, now empty of the Fianna's once vibrant spirit, he reflected on the tragic turn his life had taken. He had spent his youth and strength building a brotherhood that could conquer anything, but in the end that same brotherhood had torn itself apart. The Fianna, the shining beacon of Irish heroism, had fallen victim to human frailty, jealousy, pride and ambition. In his later years, Fionn lived a quiet life in the mountains of Glen Etive, near the waters of Loch Etive, far from the noise of battle and the harshness of the world. There, he found a sense of peace, but it was not the peace of the heart. It was the peace of an old warrior awaiting the end of a long and storied life. Though he had long since laid down his spear, the memory of his Fianna still burned brightly in his soul, even as the world around him moved on. But Fionn's legacy was not destined to fade into quiet obscurity. Though the Fianna were no longer the force they once were, their stories were immortalised by bards, poets and storytellers who would keep their deeds alive for future generations. Fionn's name was passed down through the ages, a reminder of what had been lost and what could never be reclaimed. His spirit, like the echoes of ancient battles, would always be felt in Ireland, where the memory of the Fianna and their great deeds would live on in the hearts of the people. And yet, despite the passing of time, the betrayal that had torn the Fianna apart haunted Fionn until the end of his days. The Fianna's ultimate collapse marked the end of an era, the passing of an age of heroes and the rise of a new order. Ireland was no longer a land defined by warriors and their epic quests. It was now a land in transition, where the values of kingship and law would replace the code of the warrior. Fionn's death, though not in battle, was the final chapter of his tumultuous life. It was said that he died not of illness or age, but of a broken heart, unable to bear the weight of betrayal from those he had once called his brothers. But even in death, he was not forgotten. His name, like that of Cuchulainn and other great Irish heroes, would forever echo in the heart of the land. The Fianna had fallen, but their stories would never be lost. With the demise of Fionn mac Cumhaill, the once mighty Fianna dissolved into legend, their glory fading into the shadows of time. The Fianna had been Ireland's guardians, its unyielding warriors who held the land safe through centuries of mythic conflict. But like all things touched by the hand of fate, their time had come to an end. Their downfall, however, did not signal the end of Ireland's rich history of heroes. It marked the beginning of a new era. The Fianna, once united under a common cause, had become fragmented by internal strife, pride, and ambition. The warriors who had once stood together as brothers now found themselves divided by their own desires for power and glory. Fergus mac Roich, Fionn's trusted friend and one of the most powerful of the Fianna, was among the first to leave. His betrayal, aligning himself with the enemies of Ireland, signalled the collapse of the unity that had once bound the Fianna together. Though he had once been a fierce protector of Ulster, his choice to side with the forces of Ailill mac Mata proved that even the greatest of warriors could be led astray by personal ambition. The betrayal of Fergus hurt Fionn deeply, for they had once been inseparable. They had fought side by side in battles that had shaped Ireland's history. The division of the Fianna left Fionn reeling. His strength had always come from his leadership and the unbreakable bond he shared with his warriors, but that bond had shattered. In its place was a fractured legacy, one that could no longer be pieced together. Without their leader and their unity, the remaining members of the Fianna slowly faded from the stage of Ireland's history. Oisin, the son of Fionn, once destined to lead the Fianna after his father, found himself torn between his loyalty to his people and his growing desire to seek peace. He left the mortal world behind, journeying to the other world with Niamh of the golden hair, the fairy princess who had captured his heart. Oisin's departure marked the final chapter in the history of the Fianna, and the golden age of Irish heroes came to a close. As Oisin disappeared into the mists of the otherworld, the once vibrant land of warriors was left to its own devices. The remaining Fianna, scattered and broken, no longer had the will or strength to protect Ireland. The great warriors who had once kept watch over the land were now nothing more than fading legends. Yet, even as the Fianna crumbled, a new force was beginning to rise in Ireland, the High Kings. With the fall of the warriors came the rise of kingship, and Tara, the ancient seat of power, became the symbol of Ireland's future. The High Kings of Tara would be the ones to unify the island and protect it from external threats. They would rule not with the sword alone, but with wisdom, diplomacy, and law. The first of these kings was Cuchulainn's descendant, Conchobar mac Nessa, a ruler who would unite the provinces of Ireland and give birth to a new era of governance. Yet even as Ireland's future seemed to shift towards the establishment of stable rule and centralised power, the shadow of the Fianna and their stories would linger long after their fall. The legacy of the great heroes of Ireland would never be completely erased, for their names would echo through the ages, carried by the songs of bards and the whispers of the people. But Ireland had changed. The sword and spear, once the tools of kings and warriors alike, were now overshadowed by the quill and parchment. The old ways of the Fianna, marked by courage in battle and loyalty among brothers, had given way to the rule of law and the intricate politics of kingship. And yet, there was a price to be paid for the Fianna's fall. The magic of Ireland, once protected by the gods and the warriors of the Fianna, now seemed to fade. Where there had once been giants roaming the hills, where great magical beasts had ruled the forests, now there was silence. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods who had once walked the earth, had long retreated into the other world, and with their absence the world of magic seemed to fade as well. Ireland was now a land ruled by men, and while it was still steeped in its myths, those myths were beginning to feel distant, as if the veil between the mortal and the magical was growing thinner. The death of Fionn mac Cumhaill and the end of the Fianna marked the closing of a chapter in Irish mythology. But the story was far from over. The High Kings of Tara would rise to power, and their reign would be built on the lessons learned from the mighty warriors of the past. They would guide Ireland into a new era, one where power would be determined not by the sword but by the unity of the people and the strength of their laws. But even as the Fianna fell, the stories of the great warriors, the gods and the heroes would continue to shape the land. The memory of Fionn, Cuchulainn and Oisin, and the stories of their adventures would live on in the songs of the bards and in the hearts of the Irish people. Though their bodies had long since fallen to the earth, their spirits lived on, and the land of Ireland remained ever rich with myth and legend. In the end, Ireland was not a land of warriors alone, but a land of stories, and as long as those stories were told, the Fianna would never truly fall. With the Fianna now relegated to legend, Ireland entered a new era, an era in which kingship, rather than the valour of warriors, would define the island's fate. The High Kings of Tara would rise, their reigns marked not by the epic battles of old, but by the delicate balance of governance, diplomacy, and the shaping of Ireland's future. The sword, once the ultimate symbol of power, was now complemented by the written word and the law. The first of these kings was Lugh mac Con, a descendant of the great heroes who had once shaped the land. His rise to power marked the beginning of a new chapter for Ireland, a chapter where the age of magical beings, gods, and legendary warriors slowly faded into myth, and the island was ruled by men. Yet, even as the mortal kings began to claim their thrones, the influence of the ancient past still lingered, for Ireland's history and culture were deeply intertwined with its mythological legacy. The High Kings of Tara were chosen not only for their strength and ability to command armies, but for their wisdom, fairness, and understanding of the land's laws. They were seen as protectors, guardians of the people, and leaders who upheld the ancient traditions. But they also had to contend with the complexities of a changing world. The days of the Fianna, warriors who roamed the wilds, bound only by loyalty and courage, had given way to an era where the most powerful weapon was not the spear, but the sceptre. The High Kings would rule Ireland as a unified whole, something that had long been a dream for many of the island's disparate tribes. Tara, the ancient hill fort and centre of power, became the heart of Ireland's new political order. The kings who sat upon the stone of destiny at Tara were more than just rulers. They were symbols of unity, the living embodiment of Ireland's connection to both its ancient gods and its mortal people. Yet their role was not without its challenges. The rise of Lugh mac Con came at a time when the provinces of Ireland were still divided. Ulster, Connaught, Leinster and Munster all had their own kings, their own ambitions and their own cultures. For centuries these provinces had been united only by their common history and the occasional force of arms. But under the guidance of the High Kings of Tara, Ireland was slowly becoming a unified kingdom, with one ruler above all capable of ensuring peace and resolving disputes between the provinces. Lugaid's reign was marked by a series of important political and military victories. He successfully quelled rebellions in the provinces, brought rival tribes into submission, and strengthened Tara's authority over Ireland. His rule was an era of consolidation, where the political structure that would eventually shape Ireland for centuries began to take form. But the rise of the High Kings was not without its opposition. While Lugaid and his successors worked to unify the island, old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Many of the former Fianna members, those who had once fought beside Fionn MacCumhaill, found it hard to accept the new order. They had known a time when Ireland's leaders were chosen through strength, not lineage or law, and the transition to a more structured, peaceful rule was not always welcomed by the old guard. The High Kings of Tara had to contend with these old tensions. Battles fought not in the fields, but in the hearts and minds of the people. As the Kings of Tara sought to establish peace and order, there were those who still looked back to the days of the Fianna with longing, wishing for the wild days of battle and heroism to return. And yet, in the face of these tensions, the High Kings managed to maintain their position. They ruled wisely, though their reigns were often fraught with conflict, both internal and external. Some kings ruled for decades, while others met their end in violent struggles or political intrigue. Despite these challenges, the High Kings of Tara managed to establish a lasting legacy. Over time, their rule became synonymous with the idea of Ireland itself, one united land, bound together by the strength of its kings and the loyalty of its people. One of the most notable kings of this era was Conn Cetchethach, also known as Conn of the 100 Battles. His reign marked a period of great military success and expansion. Conn was a king whose name was spoken with reverence throughout Ireland. For his victories on the battlefield and his ability to unite the provinces under his rule made him a figure of legend. His legacy would continue to shape the future of Ireland as he helped solidify the concept of a united Ireland under a single monarch. But even Conn, one of the greatest high kings, could not escape the shadow of the past. The land that he ruled was still steeped in the myths and legends of the gods, the warriors, and the heroes of Ireland's ancient history. Though Ireland had moved beyond the age of the Fianna and the gods, those stories remained in the hearts of the people. The High Kings of Tara ruled not just with power, but with the weight of history behind them. They were kings who understood the importance of the old ways, even as they sought to build a new order for their people. The High Kings were not just political rulers, they were also spiritual leaders, deeply connected to the ancient myths and the land's sacred places. The Stone of Destiny at Tara was believed to have been imbued with magical power, and it was said that the king who sat upon it would have the right to rule all of Ireland. This connection to the land's spiritual and mythological heritage gave the High Kings a unique role in Irish society, one that bridged the gap between the mortal world and the world of the gods. Yet, despite their power and influence, the High Kings of Tara could never fully escape the pull of the past. The memory of the Fianna, the gods, and the heroes who had once ruled the land would always linger in the air like the scent of an ancient fire. The transition from the age of warriors to the age of kings was not a simple one. It was a shift that left echoes in the hearts of the people, and the ghosts of those mighty heroes would continue to shape Ireland for centuries to come. And so, the story of Ireland entered a new chapter. The age of the Fianna and the gods had passed, and a new order had taken shape under the rule of the High Kings of Tara. But the land still hummed with the memory of its mythical past. As the High Kings ruled with wisdom, their reigns were a reminder that even in the face of change, Ireland would always be a land defined by stories, by legends, and by the unbreakable connection between its people and its rich, mythical history. The High Kings of Tara ruled for centuries, uniting Ireland under a single banner, but as with all great empires, their reign eventually waned. The political unity that had been forged through battle and diplomacy slowly began to erode, replaced by internal strife and the ever-present challenge of external threats. As the political power of the High Kings weakened, so too did the influence of the old ways. The age of warriors and gods began to fade into memory as Ireland entered a new era, one that would forever change its identity. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland marked the beginning of the end for the ancient pagan traditions that had once defined the island. Christianity's spread was gradual at first, as the teachings of St. Patrick and other early missionaries slowly took root in the hearts of the Irish people. The gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, once revered in temples and sacred groves, were replaced with the Christian god, and the great warriors of old like Fionn mac Cumhaill and Cuchulainn became figures of legend rather than living history. The shift from paganism to Christianity was not without its struggles. The old ways, deeply ingrained in the culture of Ireland, were not easily abandoned. The Christian missionaries faced resistance from local kings and druids who held on to the ancient traditions, fearing the loss of their power and identity. The druids, once the spiritual leaders of the land, were now seen as enemies of the new faith, their sacred rituals and beliefs outlawed by the growing Christian establishment. The clash between the old and the new was fierce, but eventually Christianity triumphed, ushering in a new chapter for Ireland. Yet, even as the power of the old gods waned, the memory of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Fianna, and the ancient heroes remained etched in the Irish consciousness. The gods may have retreated to the other world, but their stories lived on in the folklore, songs and poetry of the people. The High Kings may have ruled with earthly power, but they could not replace the spiritual and mythological connection that the Irish had to their land. Even as Christianity took hold, the old myths endured, passed down through generations. The transition to Christianity, while it brought new religious practices and beliefs, also brought with it the preservation of Ireland's greatest stories. Monks and scribes, working in the quiet corners of monasteries, began the monumental task of writing down the myths and legends of the old world. These written texts would preserve the stories of Cuchulainn, Fionn, Oisin, and the Fianna, stories that had once been passed down orally, now set in ink for future generations. Christianity, with its emphasis on monastic life and the preservation of knowledge, played an unexpected role in ensuring that the myths of old would never be forgotten. The bards and storytellers, who had once been the primary keepers of Ireland's lore, were now joined by scribes who transcribed these stories onto parchment. The most famous of these works is the Book of Kells, a stunningly beautiful manuscript that combined Christian texts with intricate depictions of Irish myth and nature. This merging of faiths, Christian and pagan, became a hallmark of Ireland's cultural evolution. However, while the old gods and heroes were relegated to the realm of myth, their influence continued to shape the spiritual landscape of Ireland. The Christian faith did not erase the old ways, but instead integrated elements of Irish mythology into its teachings. Many of the sites where pagan rituals were once held were transformed into Christian monasteries and churches. Sacred wells, mountains, and stone circles were now associated with saints and holy figures, blending the past with the present. The holy wells, once places of pagan worship, became places of Christian pilgrimage, and the old deities' names were often replaced with saints, but the essence of their power remained. St. Patrick, the most famous of Ireland's Christian missionaries, played a key role in this transition. His arrival in Ireland in the 5th century marked a turning point in the island's spiritual history. While he is credited with converting the Irish to Christianity, it is also said that he used the pagan symbols and beliefs of the people to explain Christian concepts, thereby easing the transition. One of the most famous examples of this is the Celtic cross, a symbol that blends the Christian cross with the ancient Irish circle, representing the continuity of Ireland's spiritual heritage. Despite the rise of Christianity, many of the ancient Irish traditions persisted in the hearts and minds of the people. The sagas and epic poems of the Fianna and the Ulster cycle were not simply stories, they were the foundation of Ireland's identity. They gave the people a sense of pride, a connection to their past, and a deep understanding of their culture. Though the landscape of Ireland had changed, the stories of its heroes endured. In the centuries that followed, as Ireland was reshaped by invasions and the establishment of new kingdoms, the stories of the Fianna, Cuchulainn, and the gods of old continued to inspire. The Irish people, though now living under the rule of kings and bishops, still saw their land through the lens of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the ancient warriors. Ireland had become a land where myth and history were intertwined, where the past was never fully severed from the present. Christianity had transformed Ireland, but it had not erased the deep connection the people had to their land's ancient myths. Even as the High Kings ruled and the Church took its place as the central institution of power, the echoes of the past lingered in every stone, every hill and every river. The land itself, steeped in the memories of gods and heroes, had a story to tell, a story that would continue to resonate in the hearts of the Irish people long after the age of the Fianna had passed. As the old ways faded into the mist of time, Ireland emerged as a land where history and myth coexisted, where the stories of gods, warriors, and kings would never truly be forgotten. The legends of Ireland would continue to shape its culture, its art, and its people. And though the old gods had retreated to the otherworld, their presence could still be felt in the land, in the hearts of those who remembered their stories, and in the spirits of the heroes who once walked the earth. As centuries passed, Ireland's story became a tapestry woven from the threads of mythology, history, and faith. The myths that once echoed through the hills and forests of Ireland, carried by the winds of ancient bards, were no longer spoken aloud by the warriors of the Fianna or the gods themselves. Instead, they lived on in the hearts of the Irish people, preserved in the written word, in the songs of the bards, and in the shared identity of a people who saw themselves not only as inheritors of land and kingship, but as keepers of an ancient legacy. The story of Fionn mac Cumhaill, Cuchulainn, Oisin, and the Fianna continued to define the spirit of Ireland. Though the era of gods and epic battles had passed, the values of heroism, loyalty, and sacrifice that these figures embodied remained woven into the fabric of Irish culture. The Fianna's courage, their unbreakable bond, and their duty to protect Ireland from forces both seen and unseen became the standard by which future generations would measure their own courage. In a world now dominated by the Christian faith, where the kings ruled from their thrones and the monasteries flourished as centres of knowledge and learning, the legacy of the old myths lived on, not as a threat to the new order, but as part of the living, breathing history of the land. The high kings of Tara may have ruled from their sacred stone, but the bards and poets continued to sing of the Fianna and the ancient gods, preserving their stories for posterity. And as the written word became more widespread, Ireland's great mythological past was kept alive in manuscripts, paintings, and the oral traditions that survived through the ages. The Book of Kells, the Annals of Ulster, and countless other manuscripts began to record not just the rise and fall of kings and rulers, but also the legendary figures of Ireland's past. The Tuatha Dé Danann, though no longer worshipped as gods, were immortalised in ink. Stories of their battles, their gifts, and their role in shaping Ireland's destiny continued to shape the hearts of the Irish people, even as the world around them changed. In the quiet corners of Ireland, the sacred hill of Tara remained a symbol of the old ways. Pilgrims still visited the ancient mounds and sites where the gods had once walked. Though Christianity had spread across the land, elements of the old religion had not been completely wiped away. The deep connection between the people and their land remained, and Ireland's landscape steeped in myth and history continued to reflect the fusion of the old and the new. The holy wells where ancient pagans had once prayed were now places of Christian pilgrimage, yet the very earth seemed to hold the echoes of its ancient past. The old gods were gone, but they were never truly forgotten. As Ireland moved into the Middle Ages and beyond, the connection between its people and their mythical past remained at the heart of the national identity. The stories of the gods and heroes of the mythological cycle, Ulster cycle, Fenian cycle, and historical cycle would continue to inspire generations, shaping the very essence of what it meant to be Irish. The Irish didn't just inherit a land, they inherited a mythology that would never fade, no matter the political changes or the rise of new faiths. The legacy of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Fianna, and the great heroes like Cuchulainn would persist through the centuries, not just in the pages of old manuscripts, but in the lives and hearts of the Irish people. They were the living inheritors of a culture steeped in stories of gods, warriors, and kings. Ireland's story was and is a story of resilience and transformation. Through the passage of time, through the rise and fall of kings, the arrival of Christianity, and the ever-shifting political landscape, the myths of Ireland's past continued to resonate in the present. These myths weren't just stories of the past, they were the moral compass, the backbone of Irish culture, and the foundation of the country's spirit. And as the land itself stands today, forested, rugged, and green, with the mists rolling over the hills, those ancient myths still live on. The stories of the Fianna and the Tuatha Dé Danann, the battles of Mag Tuired, the love of Grain and Diarmuid, the heroic stand of Cuchulainn, and the wisdom of Fionn mac Cumhaill continue to inspire and shape the hearts of the Irish people, whether they are living in the bustling cities of Dublin or walking along the quiet shores of the island's remote coasts. It is said that Ireland is a land of stories, a land that remembers its past no matter how far back it stretches. The gods may no longer walk its hills, the Fianna may no longer fight its battles, and the kings of Tara may have long since passed into history, but the myths remain. They remain in the land, in the people, in the song of the wind across the fields, in the whisper of the waves on the shore, and in the hearts of those who remember. Ireland's mythological legacy, once passed down by gods and heroes, is now carried by those who keep the stories alive. The Tuatha Dé Danann, Fionn mac Cumhaill, Cuchulainn, and all the others, gods and mortals alike, remain as vibrant as ever, their stories part of the ever-evolving narrative of Ireland. The past is never fully gone. It lives on in the stories we tell, the myths we pass down, and the way we shape our future. And so, Ireland's mythology endures, forever alive, forever changing, and forever shaping the soul of the island.